This evening, we'll be discussing John's 2002 book, Pine Box Parole, Terry Fitzsimmons and the Quest to End Solitary Confinement and Other True Cases, in which he shines a light on the dangers of excessive time spent in solitary confinement and tells a number of stories of sensational crimes and criminals with whom he had personal connection, and reveals aspects of the people and cases that were not much reported. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to come into the Oshawa Library, even though I'm sitting here in Coburg.
The benefits of virtual programming is
Exactly.
we can connect but still be cozy in our homes. John, can you outline for us, for those that haven't read the book, your path to becoming a criminal defense lawyer and eventually becoming an advocate for prison reform?
Well, it started out as I hadn't intended to become a lawyer at all. I wanted to do political science at Queen's University. I ended up doing an honors BA and a master's degree in political science. And it was only by happenstance that I took the LSAT tests and scored very well on them and decided to change over and go into law school. I'm the first in my family to attend university, and so my parents were very proud that I was going into law. But as I went into the actual practice and started into criminal law, they weren't so satisfied at all. And the end result was that I ended up doing a lot of work at the St. Thomas Psychiatric Hospital, working with the inmates there who had been found not guilty by reason of insanity. And that led to Professor Ron Price at Queen's giving me a call and saying, we've heard what you're doing down at St. Thomas. Would you consider joining us on faculty here at Queen's and becoming director of the Correctional Law Project? Now, the Correctional Law Project is where I would teach second and third year law students the ins and outs of prison law. In other words, it was a clinical course where the students would go into the prisons and deal with the prisoners on various matters that would arise in a prison context. So it was very challenging. From there, I went on from Queen's to the University of Windsor and taught there. I realized that I really wanted to get back in the trenches and do that kind of work myself. So when my aunt passed away, I was able to buy her house in Coburg. I returned there and continued doing prison law practice for a number of years until I retired about 5 years ago.
Now, what led you to become the defense attorney for Terry Fitzsimmons, who is the main subject of your book?
Well, because of my work with the Correctional Law Project, I became quite famous within the prison community. People on the outside have probably never heard of me, but when you're inside, there's very few lawyers that are willing to take on your matters. So it didn't take too much to become pretty notorious in the prison field, and so I was able to become quite well known, and I was actually getting phone calls from across Canada from inmates wanting help with their cases. And it was basically just a phone call that I picked up one afternoon, ready to go on my weekend, and that was Terry Fitzsimmons on the phone telling me that he's been arrested and charged with murder, and he would like my representation. I hadn't really heard anything about Terry Fitzsimmons, although I understand his case was pretty well reported in the Toronto newspapers. But it was a case that I just decided to take on, and from there, it led to some interviews with him. And it was a difficult case because ordinarily, when people contact their lawyer, they want a defense to the charges and probably claiming they hadn't done it. In Terry's case, he had turned himself into the Ottawa police force and gave a complete confession and in fact, said that he wanted the death penalty, even though that doesn't exist in Canada. So it was kind of unique to try to put a defense for somebody who has basically spilled the beans on himself.
And what was your defense strategy, for those who haven't read the book, for the case for Terry Fitzsimmons? Because I know, because he kind of made it harder for you, right, at the beginning, because you're going in and he said he's guilty. What was your defense strategy? And I know it involved something with the work of Dr. Stuart Gracian, I believe, influenced your work.
It was trying to put together a defense. The first thing a defense lawyer does when building a criminal defense is form what's called the theory of the defense. The theory of the defense is how you're going to attack this, what kind of information you need to gather in order to support a defense. Terry was charged with 3 murders, and of course, a conviction on one as a first-degree murder would have meant a similar sentence right down the line. So it had to be something that had to be all-encompassing. And quite frankly, when I took it on, I didn't really have any understanding of what that theory of the defense would be. And it so happened that I happened to be watching a 60 Minutes program on a Sunday afternoon, and I saw an interview with Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist at Harvard University, who had done extensive work at the Pelican Bay Special Handling Unit in California. And during that interview, Dr. Gracian was able to point out the psychological damage that solitary confinement does. Now, in those days, this was 30 years ago, nobody really gave much thought to what happens in prisons, and prisoners are prisoners, and lock them away and do whatever you want to them. But Dr. Gracian was making a point that is it ethical that we, even though we can't destroy a person's body, that we could destroy a person's mind. And he pointed out that is exactly what solitary confinement does. Now, all of us have been used to the COVID lockdowns. We've been sitting in our homes and getting quite antsy. And of course, we see what's going on in China and their rebellion against the lockdowns. That was for, a couple of months where people would be locked in their home. Consider that situation if you're locked in your home, but supposing that you were not only locked in your home, you were locked in your bathroom for that period of time. Now, multiply that by 6 years, and that's what Terry Fitzsimmons went through. Now, the United Nations has been doing a lot of work on this as well, and they've come up with what they call the Mandela Rules. The Mandela Rules point out that solitary confinement is torture. So in defending Terry, I took the work that was done by Dr. Stuart Gracian and tried to convince the court for the first time in Canada that this was torture inflicted by the Correctional Service of Canada on someone. In other words, it was the Correctional Service that created a monster. Now, it's not a defense to what he did, but it could lower the penalty that he would get for first-degree murder to second-degree murder and maybe even manslaughter. But that was the tack we took. Unfortunately, Terry was so messed up. He tried to commit suicide while the defense was ongoing. Very difficult client, but nonetheless, we followed through. We had appearances in 3 different courts in Toronto, in Ottawa, and in Montreal. And it was the first time that this kind of a defense had been presented to a Canadian court. Now, jump ahead a number of years to 2019. That kind of a defense has been ongoing across Canada since that time. And finally, in 2019, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Union brought suit and got solitary confinement declared unconstitutional in Canada. So Terry was not the one that did it, but he was the first step in this quest to end solitary confinement.
That's great. You answered like three of my questions with one question. My next question was going to be about solitary confinement being banned in Canada, but I've read too, and you mentioned this in your book, something called structured intervention units, or SIUs. Now, what's the difference between those and solitary confinement? And do you see this new system as a positive move forward, or is it just solitary by another name?
Well, it has been put forward by the government once the solitary was declared unconstitutional as an alternative to solitary confinement. We all realize that guarding prisoners is a tough task, and you can't just leave the guards saying you let these boys do whatever they want. Of course, the intervention that they now use is supposedly much more humane. The idea is that no one should stay in longer than 15 days, certainly not 6 years, and that there should be at least 4 hours of interpersonal contact allowed each day, so that a person doesn't get this mental disease, very much like post-traumatic stress disorder. That would come about from total isolation. The problem is that in putting forward this new system, the tendency has been to treat things the way they've always been done. And so studies that have been done by University of Toronto criminologists have found that really not much has changed. They now call it structured intervention units, but much of the same kind of torture that was taking place in the past is continuing.
And you mentioned in your book too that you outline many injustices that are carried out in prisons, not only solitary confinement, but violence as well. And you state that many lawyers and judges are hardly aware of the extent of the punishment that some prisoners are subjected to. So why do you think this is detrimental? It seems detrimental to me. What do you think needs to change to remedy this?
Well, quite frankly, except for the Correctional Law Project at Queen's, law students are not exposed to what goes on. Most criminal lawyers, once their client is declared guilty and marched off behind the door in handcuffs, that's the extent that they know what happens. No one really knows what's going on in the prisons. It's something that the judges are not aware of. When David Cole became a judge in Toronto, he was a prison law lawyer before his appointment to the bench, and he started a program that would try to teach judges more about what's going on, and that's certainly to be admired. The number of people that have any facility with prison law, again, even amongst criminal lawyers, very small. So it takes a group such as the Canadian Prison Lawyers Association to really try to speak up. Unfortunately, we've been doing that at conferences and academic gatherings and so forth. But if any change is to be made in society, we've got to get the public to buy into it, to show what is wrong with the system. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wanted to write a book, not in legalistic terms, but I wanted to really show the public what goes on, what a person who is sentenced to a term of imprisonment experiences, what it's like to be in a prison, and why these people deserve a defense.
What do you think made it different for you as a lawyer going in and seeing it differently and wanting to approach it differently than other lawyers in your place might have done?
Well, as I said in my background, when I started my own practice in London, Ontario, I became president of the London Humane Society. And I experienced how dogs react when they're put in cages for extended periods. And we even had certain veterinarians come along and say, after a dog has been experiencing this kind of total cage lockdown for 6 weeks, they go crazy and sometimes have to be put down. So if you can, that happens to a dog. What happens when we do that to a human being? And then that's when the light really struck. You know what Dr. Gracian was saying in the States was true all over. And so that's where I decided that this had to become a major um, concern, is to try to attack and put an end to solitary confinement.
And you hinted this in the book as well, and I've read this in a number of interviews you've given on some of the reason for this is the militaristic nature of prisons and how they've been set up, and also sort of a toxic masculinity. Because of course, for many years, prison guards were male, and sort of the military training and wearing, uh, combat gear and things while they're guarding the prisoners. So it becomes more militaristic rather than corrective action for the inmates.
And one of the things that most people don't realize is that by and large, in historical terms, prisons are pretty new phenomenon. Basically, prisons started coming up around the year 1800 in most societies. Before that, prison was just a holding place until the real punishment, such as whipping or bodily mutilation, could be carried out. And it was only when reformers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Howard and the like got hold of the prison environment that they started to try to change the system but their attitude was, well, we have to make it more that people can turn to God and become penitent. And that, of course, is the origin of the word penitentiary, where they could then become penitent and turn their life around otherwise. The problem became trying to get people controlling of bad people. They had to use force. And especially after the world wars, soldiers were hired on to become prison guards, and they brought a militarism with them. And that militaristic attitude lingered for quite a number of years. It was only very recently in Canada, and probably in the 70s, that attitudes began to change, and that just the very uniform that the guards wore was changed to become less military. And hopefully by changing their uniforms, we would also change their attitudes. And that's been a long evolving process.
Now, this is kind of a controversial topic too. We get into politics and the term tough on crime, and politicians tend to throw this term around. Oh, we're tough on crime, longer prison sentences. That's going to result in a safer society. But I believe, and you've said this in the book as well, that it doesn't really pan out in the statistics that they've done or that they've analyzed to see that is society safer because of longer sentences, or is it the reverse?
Well, I would think it was the reverse. The thing is that we have, once we put a person into prison, we subject that person to a milieu where attitudes are picked up. And they can be changed around. You can have programming that goes on in prisons, but the real problem comes in release. And sometimes being released to society is tougher than going to prison in the first place. Because what happens is that we all say that the prisoner goes to prison to pay a debt to society. But what they don't tell us is that that debt bears a very high interest rate and can probably never be paid off. Once one gets released into the community, that debt remains a burden on the individual. People aren't willing to accept them in jobs, can't get a job, can't get housing, might as well go back to prison. So we end up seeing repeat offending Now, that's certainly not always the case. Some people do tremendous job at turning their life around, um, but others don't. And I think that we all bear it as a responsibility to try to assist those in the community that are trying to make it, who are trying to turn their life around. Um, the tough on crime, again, puts people behind the 8 ball. It makes sure that uh, they not only give up their home, their life, their whatever social connections they have in the community. It also makes it very difficult to reintegrate. So I was struck one time I was touring the Huntsville prison in Texas. This was at a time when the tough on crime proponents in Ottawa were trying to get rid of accelerated parole review that would let people have nonviolent offenders get released at the 1/6 of their sentence. That was to see that's not being tough on crime. They abolished it. But while I was down in Texas, before I would tour the prison, they made me watch a video on Texas justice. And one of the things I found is that for nonviolent first offenders in Texas, there is no jail. They send them directly to programming. And that is their opportunity to make sure that they don't get this attitude where you are anathema to the rest of society. You can be reintegrated. So even in a place like Texas, which we probably think of the worst of the worst, they're not as tough on crime as we are right here.
Well, I was going to be asking you about what's the difference between the Canadian and the US system as well. And so I guess it's done differently state by state, obviously. You hear about
Exactly.
these
Yeah.
supermax prisons and lots of, reform happening, but in different levels all across their country. Now, I know in your book, you talk about the word justice and sort of defining it as a concept that involves authoritative imposition of social norms.
Mhm.
So can you define that a little bit for us?
Okay, what I'm saying is that what we consider justice is really a relative term. We go back a couple of 100 years, owning people, forcing them into labor, buying and selling them. Oh, well, hey, that's legal. That's just, because our social norms had not progressed to the point where that was considered anathema. Not that long ago, we remember the University of Wyoming student, Matthew Shepard, who was beaten to death because he was gay. And it would just seem to be a norm in society that, there was no tolerance for any sort of social deviance. Now, that wasn't legal, but there was a norm there in society. Right now, the prevailing norm in society is that whatever we do to child molesters or people involved with child pornography, it's all right. And in fact, I just did an article for the Lawyers Daily about a case that was just decided this month in Toronto, where a 70-year-old high school teacher was found with a lot of child pornographic pictures on his computer. There's no suggestion that he did anything to anyone other than look at these pictures. And yet he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment because people found that just totally horrendous. In my article for the Lawyers Daily, I said, was that just? Yes, it was, because our Court of Appeal is upholding a social norm that says these deviants that prey on children should be punished to the hilt. We don't look to why people are like that. It is sort of a modern form of discrimination. And I think maybe in time, our attitudes will change. So justice changes over time. We, we would not have considered gay marriage a situation that could be approved, and yet the laws changed, our attitudes changed. So justice changes with our attitudes of what is right and wrong in society. Now, I define justice as the authoritative imposition of social norms, because obviously we don't want people taking it upon themselves and going out and saying, well, this is right and this is wrong. We need the courts there to impose the laws that express our norms and values to be there. So that's how I get the term justice is the authoritative imposition of social norms.
So you talk about ways that looking at different social norms, as you mentioned, and we're not looking at the reasons why people offend necessarily. What role do you think, in that vein, do you think psychiatry and social sciences could play in allowing Canada to improve the current institutions?
Well, what I think that we have to look to why people do bad things. And it's obviously we pick up on certain aspects. People can be driven into stealing because of poverty. They can do various things because of social pressures. One of the things that I was most cognizant of working in the psychiatric facility in St. Thomas was that psychiatry had an awful lot to offer us in terms of how to get around a lot of the perceptions and attitudes that people had that were so deeply ingrained, either through medication or through counseling. One of the people that I worked with at the St. Thomas Psychiatric Hospital was a woman who killed a cab driver, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. And she ended up, after a very short time, cooperative with the psychiatric help that she was given. She turned her situation around so that we were able to gradually get her released. So she didn't do very many years at the psychiatric hospital. And to my knowledge, she's never again reoffended.
Now, the foreword of your book was written by Raphael Rowe, who was wrongfully convicted in 1990 for a 1988 murder and series of aggravated robberies. And eventually he was exonerated and released in 2000. So how did he become involved in writing the foreword of your book?
I've been working with Raphael Rowe on another project that I've got going. And I've been very impressed with him. For those who might be listening in that don't know who Raphael Rowe is, he is the host of the Netflix series Inside the World's Toughest Prisons. He's a British broadcaster who, as he says in every episode of Inside the World's Toughest Prison, that he did a number of years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Raphael is one of those exceptions. He came out, he's very articulate, very smart guy, and he turned his life around. He made it his life work to get on BBC, and then now is using his experiences, having been imprisoned himself, to talk about imprisonment around the world. I've had various Zoom meetings with him in consulting on another project. And so we got to know one another that way. And I just came out and asked him, well, would you share your experiences? Would you take a look at my book and read it? And if you find it useful, I'll write a foreword for it. And he not only did that, but he's also put an ad for the book on British television.
It's good to have. Well, you network as you're doing these things in your career,
Exactly.
Right? You come across people, and people can help you forward the research that you've done and the all the advocacy you've been doing to make it more apparent to the public what's happening. And a quote you had from the book, which I found quite timely, or just it really resonated with me, was that quote, I have sometimes been of the belief that prison walls are as much for keeping out the public's knowledge of what goes on inside prisons as they are keeping inmates in. And I wondered, from the perspective of transparency, what would have to change in Canadian institutions to make the process more transparent so that the public would be aware and more accountable, and there'd be sort of oversight on what's happening in the prisons to make sure that things are happening above board?
Well, I think there has to be, first of all, public demand. And the problem is that we don't really want to know what's going on in prisons. We know that bad people should be locked away, and we don't want to see from them or hear from them ever again. Unfortunately, the victims' rights movement has made sure that we don't give any sort of comfort to those people who have done wrong in society. Now, I'm not saying that victims are not to be treated kindly, but it should not be at the expense of making sure that we're not actually harming ourselves by making sure that there's a caste that's out there that are ready to prey upon us again when they get out, and eventually they will get out.
Well, and I've read, I think you mentioned this in another interview, that prison itself is the punishment. You don't go there for punishment, you're there as the punishment.
As punishment, not for punishment. And so one of the guards at one of the institutions read my book and then wrote me quite a lengthy letter explaining that he was brought into the system. He had formerly been a social worker himself, but he was trained as what to do by a lot of people who had this military background. And what he called, we have to every so often give the inmates a tune-up, which was basically a beating, making their life as discomfortable as possible. And unfortunately, whether it be at an inquest or at a court or any sort of place where the correctional service there's an eye upon it, their attitude is, oh, nothing's wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. There just seems to be a whole denial of any responsibility that maybe things can go wrong inside. And so part of the job of a prison law lawyer is to bring suit against the Correctional Service of Canada for violating those rights that not only the prisoners, but all Canadians should hold dear.
Well, on that note, I've run out of questions for you. I don't know if it was exactly 20 questions. I think it was 18. I lost track. I wasn't sure. We're going to open up now to anyone who's in, if there's any questions in the question and answer chat box there. I don't see any questions coming in. Anybody who has questions can put them in the chat box. I know that for me, I've learned so much in reading this book and educating myself as a member of the public and I think we need to start to hold public officials accountable, because of course funding is a major issue as well in prisons. If they're not offering these programs, like Terry Fitzsimmons himself, when you were defending him, was as a result of him going out and killing 3 people shortly after being released from prison, after being in solitary confinement, but having no sort of rehabilitation, re-entry programs. And that to me shows that the system didn't have the programs in place. Is it because of funding, or is it because they don't think that the inmates need the help?
Part of the problem was that there was legislation in place that had they had the programming available, they could have spotted that Terry was going to be a problematic release, and they could have used a provision that they call gating, which would mean that he would have to spend the entire length of his prison sentence in prison or until such time as he had completed sufficient programming. Part of the job of the correctional services is to look upon what the needs are of an offender who is to be released. And in Terry's case, it just didn't happen. He's reached a date where he should be released. Let's just turn him out on the street with no preparation at all for walking free. Unfortunately, it backfired, not only on the public, but on Terry as well. He basically put himself where he had nothing to do but die after that. It's a dreadful story of a wasted life. But what I do argue in my book is that for certain people, prison is the only place they should ever go. They're just too dangerous to be released. I don't think Terry was a psychopath because psychopaths can show no feeling. And I think that what the book reveals in Terry as he tells his story is that he developed very deep feelings for his colleague, Don Hebert, and to the point where it became almost a bromance. And he really felt deeply about Don. And one of actually the only instruction I was given in defending is that you are not to say anything bad about Don Hebert. What that ended up telling me is that this is not the typical psychopath that only cares about himself. This is a guy who had actually some feeling, but because of the treatment that he received in the penitentiary system, his humanity was taken away.
And I think too, we can draw parallels with someone who, like, there was no indication with Terry from a young age. He had a relatively stable upbringing, kind of middle-class family, and, went off the rails, I think, hanging out with the wrong crowd and getting into the wrong type of activity. And then, minor offenses and escalating and leading him to prison, but then he became institutionalized.
Exactly.
Right? And he actually he didn't like to be around a lot of other people.
Yeah, just groups and noises really shook him after his release. But my concern is that, did we really do enough as a society for the adolescent Terry Fitzsimmons? Surely when people are dropping out of school and getting involved in drugs and so forth, they're not that hard to spot in society. And maybe if we had forgotten about just throwing him in jail, maybe if we had taken some time to work with him as an adolescent, we could have done a lot more and eventually saved him a number of lives. I mentioned that my aunt was a public school teacher, and I talked to her a number of times, and she said, I can tell kids who are going to go on to do bad things in their life, because you can spot them even as 6 and 7 year olds, that they have an attitude about them that it's going to be very difficult to correct. Well, the question for me is, if it's spottable at that age, wouldn't society be better off to invest the resources in trying to make sure that those troubles that the child has experienced don't grow worse and end up leading to someone having to go to prison?
Now, there's a question that's come in actually from Marcy in the chat box here. She says, "Thank you for this excellent interview, John. Have you found politics to be supportive or indifferent to the messaging of your book?"
I found that politicians on the whole, it's not something that would captivate them because there's more votes to be gained by pandering to the public. Let's make our streets safer. Let's hire more police, just as Mayor John Tory is proposing to do in Toronto. Let's get tough on crime. But for those people who probably I would not have thought supportive of prison justice, who have read my book, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Yeah, I never realized that this was the situation, and are actually quite supportive of the attitudes that I represent in the book. So maybe if we can turn the public around, we can get the politicians to turn as well.
Every step counts, right? Like every little bit, your book getting out there and us talking about this tonight in our small group, hearts and minds, right? Winning them over.
Exactly.
We have
Nicole,
another
go ahead, Nicole. I was just going to mention we do have another question from Maria, if you wanted me to read it out.
Go ahead.
What kind of support do released prisoners get, or do they just fend for themselves? Instead of more policing, what might be better solutions?
Well, for a federal penitentiary inmate to be released to the street, he can either do it by parole, which you become eligible at 1/3, but not everyone gets it, or they can be released on what's called statutory release at the 2/3 point of their sentence. If they are released at statutory release, or if they're out on parole, they are supervised in the community by a community parole officer. My problem and complaint with that system is that instead of being a resource to help inmates reintegrate, too often these parole officers see themselves as enforcement agencies of their own and use the threat of putting the person back in penitentiary as a whip. So it's not the carrot, it's the whip that they use. And that makes the person who is subject to supervision very resentful and less cooperative. I think that what we want to do is to have a system where the parole officers and rehabilitation in the community is seen as beneficial, and that these parole officers will work with the inmate. Now, obviously, there's going to be some that are really mess up and deserves to be thrown back in jail. But if they're having trouble getting a job, let's work on them. Let's teach them how to open a bank account. Most of them don't even know how to do that. Let's teach them how to write a resume and present themselves when they go to do a job. Most inmates, I find, are really willing and ready and able to work and get a job. It's the problem when you have to sign a statement that I have no criminal record, or I am bondable, that makes sure that you don't get the job and you end up being a burden to society. No one wants to be a burden to society. We all want to make our contribution, and I think inmates are no less involved in that than the rest of us. The only problem is that we don't trust them, and we're not really there to help them.
Like you say, it's almost like one strike and you're out. Like, you get in and you can't get that. It's like a mark on your card that you can never get off again.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And most inmates that are released, they tell me that it's like walking around, like they don't realize that they look just like another human being. To them, all eyes are cast on them. Everybody knows when they're walking down the street that they have just been released from jail. It's a tremendous burden on them. And I think that there's that degree of discomfort. And of course, the longer we hold them in jail, the more uncomfortable things become. I recall one inmate that was released. He went to a halfway house in a city. He would not go across the street. He just go for walks. He would just walk around the block. So he would never have to cross the road. He had become so institutionalized just crossing the road was a torture that he saw himself having to endure.
It's just, I think too, there's some that, well, in the past, they've published lists, the police would publish lists of who'd been released from prison, you know, people's names being in the paper and that kind of thing. And that sort of puts it, you know, keeps the black mark coming up. It's like you can never get it off. You do a Google search and you'd find that person's name always. And I think there's some movement to stop doing that in police reports and things.
Well, there was a fellow that was about to be released a number of years ago to Peterborough. And in my prison law practice, while I was in Coburg, was the first time I brought a suit against the Police Services Board of Peterborough for publishing the name of this fellow who had been involved with as a sexual offender. But the police report so emblazoned the public outrage against this guy that he was just not welcome in the community. Unfortunately, we ended up settling that lawsuit. He decided he wasn't going to go to Peterborough anyway, and he moved about, and he ended up going to a number of different communities, but basically he was exiled because of his crime, and yet he was never ever again convicted of any similar crime. So we use exile as a way of making sure that the public is safe.
Well, I think if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank you all for attending this evening's program. I don't know if there's any closing words you'd like to say, John, before we wrap up this evening.
Well, thank you to the Oshawa Public Library for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book. I understand that it's available at the library, and of course it's available at local bookstores, and if they don't have it, ask them to order it, and also on Amazon. So
yes, we do have it in the Oshawa Library's collections. If you check the chat, for those that can view the chat, you can see it's in our library catalog. We have it in print as an ebook, as well as an e-audiobook, so you can have it downloaded to your device and listen to it, which is how I listen to it. So please make sure you check it out and follow up and let us know what you thought of this program. We'd love to hear from you. I'd like to thank John Hill for sharing his knowledge and expertise on this very sensitive and divisive topic. I hope that you, as the audience, like me, have learned a great deal from this talk. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.